It begins with a whisper in the dark, a story told not in the daylight of reason, but in the candle-lit hush of superstition. In a forgotten corner of a provincial museum, behind glass clouded by time, lies a fragment of fabric. To the casual visitor, it might appear as nothing more than a yellowed scrap of lace, frayed at the edges, brittle from centuries of neglect. But to those who know its legend, it is not lace at all. They claim it is a relic of something unspeakable, a wedding veil woven not of silk, but of the very bodies and souls of the witch's victims. The glass display offers no explanation, no inscription beyond a faded card that simply reads "Veil Fragment, c. 1700. Yet the story clings to it like smoke, a tale too dreadful to be catalogued among ordinary textiles. It is said that the veil belonged to a woman who never sought love but vengeance. Her bridal garment, instead of a symbol of purity, became a shroud of death. The villagers whispered that every stitch concealed a secret, every thread bound by more than cloth. Imagine the scene: a dim cottage on the edge of a wood, the creak of a loom echoing in the silence, the air heavy with the metallic tang of blood. Neighbors claimed that when the woman worked late into the night, faint cries could be heard rising from the spinning wheel, as if the very fibers resisted being drawn into thread. Some swore they saw shadows flicker across her windows, shapes that did not belong to her alone. And when men vanished, men who had once courted her or crossed her, suspicion turned inevitably toward the loom and the veil taking shape upon it. To understand why this veil inspires such dread, we must step into the past, into an age when belief and fear were indistinguishable, when the border between folklore and reality blurred until they became one. In Europe's darker centuries, a veil was not merely an ornament for the bride. It was a threshold object, concealing the face, shielding the soul, symbolizing the passage from one life to another. And if that veil was corrupted, if it was twisted into something unholy, then so too was the destiny of the one who wore it. Folklore insists that this woman was once betrothed. Some versions say she was abandoned at the altar, humiliated before her entire village. Others claim she was widowed, left to face the world in solitude and poverty. In both strands of the tale, betrayal is the seed. What flowered from that seed, however, is something darker. She took to weaving not with wool or flax, but with materials no human hand should dare to spin. Hair from the heads of the dead, threads steeped in blood, shavings of bone ground fine as dust. These were the whispers the villagers told, each retelling adding more horror to the tapestry. When at last she completed the veil, it was said to shimmer like ordinary lace at first glance, but under moonlight it revealed its true nature. Faces flickered across it, eyes open in silent screams, mouths frozen in terror. Those who claimed to have seen it were never the same. One man is said to have clawed at his eyes after glimpsing the veil, screaming that the dead were staring back at him. Another refused to sleep beneath a roof again, terrified that the veil would descend over him in the night like a net. But legends are not built from a single night's terror. They grow from repetition, from whispered accounts spreading through taverns and marketplaces, from parents warning children to stay away from the woman in the woods. In every retelling, the veil grew larger, its horror more intricate, until it was no longer just an accessory but a prison of souls. Whether the villagers believed the story out of fear or fascination hardly mattered. Fear, after all, has always been stronger than truth. And yet there is a peculiar detail that keeps the story alive. For centuries, fragments of the veil are said to have resurfaced. A scrap in a nobleman's cabinet of curiosities, a strip sewn into a church banner only to cause misfortune, a remnant found in a trunk beneath a ruined house. Each appearance was marked by calamity, unexplained deaths, fires, madness. Those who tried to destroy it by burning or tearing discovered it resisted destruction, as though the very material defied the natural world. Some whispered that it was not fabric at all, but a vessel, a prison binding the essence of those who had vanished. The fragment resting in the museum today may be nothing more than lace aged to a strange yellow, but once you know the story, it becomes impossible to see it as innocent. Visitors report feeling uneasy when standing near it, some insisting the air grows colder, others saying they smell iron, like rust or dried blood. A curator once admitted, off record, that the fragment occasionally seems to shift slightly inside its case, as though an invisible hand adjusts it. Rational minds dismiss this as the tricks of temperature and shadow, but the legend insists it is the veil reminding us it is not yet finished, that it still longs for new threads. As the candlelight flickers against the glass, the fragment waits in silence. It may be a relic of hysteria, a superstition woven tighter over time, or it may be something else entirely, the surviving piece of a veil that once bound flesh and spirit into one horrific tapestry. Its story, stitched across centuries, remains unanswered. Was it truly the work of a vengeful witch, or was it the village itself, fearful, suspicious, and desperate for an enemy, that wove the darker tale? This is where the mystery begins, with a veil that is neither fully here nor gone, both artifact and accusation. A veil that holds within its threads the possibility of murder, magic, and madness. And as we pull at its edges, thread by thread, we will discover not only the story of a woman condemned, but also the shadowed corners of our own history, where myth and memory cannot be separated, and where fabric may hold the weight of souls. Every legend is stitched not only from fear, but also from older stories that came before it. To understand how a veil could be believed to hold human victims within its threads, we must look beyond the single tale of a witch and her vengeance. We must enter the older, stranger world of weaving itself, a world where thread was never only thread, where cloth carried with it the weight of fate, destiny, and death. For as long as humanity has spun fiber into fabric, the loom has been seen as more than a tool. It was an altar, a place where the ordinary was transformed into the extraordinary. Among the ancient Greeks, three figures stood above all others in their command of life's threads, the moirai, or fates. Clotho spun the thread of each person's life, Lachesis measured its length, and Atropos cut it when the time had come. In Norse sagas, the Norns gathered at the base of Yggdrasil, the world tree weaving the fates of gods and men alike. Even in Slavic folklore, witches were often depicted with spindles, not brooms, for it was with thread that they ensnared both lovers and enemies. Across cultures, weaving was not merely craft, it was cosmic power. This symbolic force made cloth sacred, but it also made it dangerous. Every garment was thought to carry something of its maker and its wearer. A shroud could bind the soul to the body in burial. A wedding veil could protect the bride from evil spirits on her crossing into married life. But a cursed piece of fabric, that could just as easily entangle the living and the dead, binding them together in ways no one could undo. In early modern Europe, where fear of witches ran rampant, the tools of weaving were often treated as suspicious objects. Court records from witch trials in Germany and Scotland describe looms, spinning wheels, and distaffs seized as instruments of sorcery. Accusers claimed that women enchanted thread to cause illness, infertility, or sudden death. In one Scottish case, a woman was accused of tying knots into a thread, each knot meant to inflict pain upon a man who had scorned her. Another trial in Germany described a widow who allegedly spun wool soaked in blood, using it to cast curses on her neighbors. Whether these acts were real or merely imagined, the idea was clear: fabric was never just fabric. It was a vessel capable of carrying the intentions of its maker. Now imagine the fear that would blossom if someone believed a woman had taken this ancient symbolism one step further. Not just spinning thread to curse a rival, but spinning the very essence of a human being into her weaving. Hair, bones, blood, all physical remnants of life, woven into the bridal veil, meant to crown her in purity. In a time when villagers already feared curses hidden in knots or charms sewn into hems, such an idea was both horrifying and entirely believable. The legend of the witch's veil did not appear in a vacuum. It grew in soil already rich with stories of cursed garments. In parts of Italy, it was whispered that certain tailors stitched the evil eye into coats or dresses, bringing ruin to those who wore them. In Ireland, banshees were said to braid their hair into ribbons that brought death to anyone who touched them. Among Romani tales, there are accounts of shawls believed to suffocate their owners at night, as though the cloth itself came alive. These superstitions laid the groundwork for villagers to believe that a bridal veil could contain something far more sinister than silk. Even the very color of the veil carried meaning. Today we imagine bridal veils as white, a symbol of innocence. But in the centuries when this story emerged, white was not the universal choice. In some regions, brides wore red for fertility or black for wealth and solemnity. If this witch's veil was indeed dark in hue, as some versions of the story insist, then its very shade may have unsettled those around her, marking it as an unholy inversion of purity. Instead of shielding the bride from evil, it was believed to welcome it. And what of the loom itself, the instrument of creation? In folklore, looms were often likened to coffins, their frames resembling the boundaries of death. A loom's rhythmic creak could sound, in the imagination of villagers, like a dirge. The act of weaving became a metaphor for binding spirits. It is easy to see how, in the minds of fearful neighbors, a woman weaving late into the night could be recast as a sorceress, conjuring dark power with every movement of her shuttle. Historical fragments hint at these beliefs. Folklorists in the 19th century, collecting tales from rural European villages, noted repeated mentions of cloth woven with sorrow, or of the cursed thread that entangles the soul. These accounts are not tied to one specific witch, but speak to a broader superstition that fabric could absorb emotion, memory, even life itself. Over time, these motifs converged into the more focused legend of the witch and her veil. The symbolism of weaving fate is not confined to Europe. In Japanese folklore, the figure of the tsukumogami tells of objects gaining spirits after 100 years of use. A loom left unused might awaken, spinning ghostly cloth of its own accord. In South American myths, certain shamans were said to weave cloth infused with protective spirits, or in darker tales, with the souls of the condemned. These parallels show that across cultures, humanity has long carried a primal fear that fabric could hold more than fiber, that threads could bind what should never be bound. When we return to the story of the witch's veil through this wider lens, the horror deepens. The veil becomes not just a local curiosity, but part of an ancient archetype. The cursed garment, the enchanted weaving, the thread of life stolen and rewoven. To the villagers, this was not metaphor. It was evidence. Every creak of her loom became a whisper of the damned. Every stitch was seen as a trap. And when suitors vanished, it required no leap of imagination to connect their absence with the growing veil. The name of the woman who wove this veil may have been forgotten, blurred into myth, but the power of her story lies in what it represents. The veil itself is a convergence point of ancient mythologies, of cultural anxieties about women's power, of the tangible fear of witchcraft that gripped early modern Europe. Blood and silk, thread and bone, life and death, all entangled in a single piece of fabric. And so the legend endured. Even today, when we look upon the fragment behind glass, the unease we feel is not only about one alleged witch. It is about the weight of centuries whispering to us that cloth can carry something beyond our understanding, that every thread may be a tether, that the veil, no matter how frayed, still carries with it the lingering question, what or who is woven inside. There are countless versions of her story, and in each retelling she takes on a slightly different face. Some call her a widow who buried too many husbands, a woman who wore grief like a second skin. Others say she was a young bride abandoned at the altar, her humiliation festering into rage so deep it curdled her very soul. Still others whisper she was never meant to marry at all, that she used the illusion of a wedding as a lure, drawing men into her home with the promise of vows that would never be spoken. What is consistent across the versions, however, is that she was a figure set apart from her community. In a village where women were expected to remarry quickly or live under the supervision of male relatives, she chose or was forced to live alone. Independence for a woman was always dangerous in those centuries. A woman who owned her own land or tended her own hearth was seen as suspicious. A woman who refused to explain her comings and goings was marked. The villagers gave her a name they muttered under their breath: witch. Descriptions of her appearance vary, though a few striking images remain constant. Her hair was said to be black as pitch, though streaked prematurely with white, as though lightning had burned across her head. Her skin, some said, was pale as bone, while others claimed it glowed with a strange, feverish flush. What most stories agree upon is her attire. She dressed in black, not only in mourning but as her daily garb, where other women wore muted earth tones. She cloaked herself in the darkness of midnight, her gown said to swallow the light. The choice of black had meaning. In certain regions of Europe during the 16th and 17th centuries, black garments were both costly and unsettling. To wear black was to display wealth, dyes were expensive, but also to signal power and separation. Widows wore black, yes, but for a limited time. For a woman to wear it indefinitely was to signal she had stepped outside the boundaries of communal life, that she had chosen shadow over belonging. For the villagers, her black gown became a symbol of her rebellion and eventually of her alleged sorcery. In folklore, she was painted as a paradoxical figure, both beautiful and terrifying, alluring yet deadly. Men were drawn to her despite themselves. Farmers whispered that they saw her walking alone by the river, her veil trailing behind her like mist, and felt compelled to follow. Soldiers passing through the village lingered too long in her gaze, claiming later that her eyes seemed to hold an entire night sky. And yet those who entered her home were rarely seen again. Those who did return told half-mad tales of a room heavy with incense, of walls draped with unfinished cloth, of the sound of weeping that came from nowhere and everywhere at once. Her reputation grew not only from rumor, but from the fears that haunted every small community of that era. Cattle sickened, crops failed, children fell ill. All the calamities of ordinary life demanded an explanation. And in a world ruled by suspicion, that explanation was often found in a woman who did not conform. She became the vessel for blame, the body onto which the community projected its fears. If the harvest rotted, it was because she had cursed it. If a man strayed into her home and vanished, it was because she had consumed him. In this way, the story of her veil began to weave itself long before any proof was sought. But there is another thread running through the legend, one that suggests she was not merely a victim of hysteria, but a wielder of forbidden knowledge. Folklore insists she inherited a book, a small grimoire passed down from her mother or grandmother, containing incantations tied to weaving and spinning. This book, they say, taught her how to bind not only cloth, but the very essence of living beings. Some villagers swore they saw strange marks carved into her spinning wheel, symbols that looked more like runes than decoration. Others claimed she sang while weaving, a song in no language they recognized, and that the cloth seemed to shimmer as though alive. Was she truly a sorceress? Or was she a woman who understood the power of fear, who cloaked herself in mystery to protect her solitude? It is impossible to know. What we do know is that her legend shaped her into something larger than life, something both human and monstrous. The villagers called her the Bride in Black, not because she had ever walked down an aisle, but because she carried with her the aura of a wedding gone wrong, an eternal bride waiting at an altar that would never be blessed. And the veil, always the veil. In some accounts, she worked on it obsessively for years, weaving by candlelight until her fingers bled. In others, it appeared suddenly, as if conjured whole. But however it came into being, the veil was said to be her constant companion. She wore it while she walked in the fields, its shadow trailing her like a storm cloud. She draped it across her window, the faint outline of faces visible when moonlight struck. When she moved through the village, the veil shimmered faintly, so thin it seemed to dissolve into the air, yet always there, always unsettling. The darker versions of the story insist she intended to wear the veil not at a wedding, but at a ritual, that she prepared for a midnight ceremony where vows would be spoken not to a husband, but to forces beyond this world. In this version, the veil was her altar, her tool of binding, the fabric that would connect her forever to the spirits of those she had ensnared. Whether she was a scorned lover, a grieving widow, or a sorceress who rejected the bonds of society, the truth is this: she became a figure both feared and desired. To the men who courted her, she was a temptation. To the women of the village, she was a warning. To the children, She was a story told to keep them from wandering too far at night. And to history, she became something more, a myth stitched together with threads of fear, tragedy, and fascination. The bride in black stands at the center of the tale, not as a passive figure but as its weaver. Whether her veil was literal or imagined, whether her sorcery was real or projected, she embodied the possibility that a woman alone could command power that others could not explain. And in a world that feared female power more than almost anything else, that was enough to condemn her. The story of the bride in black would never have survived without the whispers of the village that surrounded her. It was not she alone who shaped the legend, but the chorus of frightened voices that carried her name from one hearth to another, until rumor became truth, and truth became myth. In the village where she lived, small, clustered, surrounded by thick forests, the nights were long and heavy, candlelight was precious, and shadows seemed to stretch farther than they should. People depended on one another for survival, but dependence also bred suspicion. Every family wanted to protect itself from disaster, and disaster was everywhere. Crops blighted, livestock sickened, infants taken by fever, men injured in the fields or on the road. Misfortune needed a cause, and in those centuries, cause was rarely sought in science or chance. It was sought in the nearest figure, who stood apart, and she stood apart in every possible way. She did not attend church services as often as others, or when she did, she lingered at the edge of the congregation. She walked the fields alone at dawn, her black garments making her appear like a silhouette against the morning mist. Children whispered that she spoke to birds, and that crows followed her as if waiting for scraps. Women claimed to hear her voice late at night, drifting on the wind like a lullaby sung to no one. The smallest irregularity became evidence, each quirk transformed into accusation. Whispers grew louder when men began to disappear. A traveling merchant who had been seen speaking with her was later found nowhere on the road he was meant to take. A shepherd boy who carried her a gift of milk never returned home. Even those who disliked superstition admitted that too many had gone missing, and all roads seemed to lead to the same door. When asked, she smiled faintly, or said nothing at all, and silence was as good as guilt in a place already brimming with fear. It was not only the vanishings that fed the whispers. Other omens hung heavy in the air. Sheep turned up dead in their pens, their wool stained red though no predator had been seen. Horses shied violently whenever led past her cottage, as though some unseen hand tugged at their reins. On nights when her loom was heard creaking through the walls, villagers swore the dogs howled in unison, their cries carrying through the village until dawn. Every sound became sinister once her name was attached to it. One tale tells of a miller's daughter who wandered too close to the witch's home. She returned with a lock of her hair missing, cut clean from her head, and she swore that the woman in black had stood in the doorway, veil draped over her face, scissors glinting in the candlelight. The child sickened soon after and died within weeks, and from that moment onward, every mother warned her children never to cross the boundary where her land began. In taverns and marketplaces, stories multiplied like weeds. Some said she had been seen carrying bundles wrapped in cloth to the river, letting the current take them downstream. Others claimed she spoke to shadows, her words slipping through the cracks of her door like smoke. A few even swore that faces could be glimpsed in her windows at night, faces that were not hers pressed against the glass, pale and sorrowful. The whispers were not just idle talk, they were tools. Villagers wielded them like weapons, ensuring that their own misfortunes could be shifted onto someone else's shoulders. If a harvest failed, it was because she had cursed the fields. If a marriage soured, it was because she had enchanted the husband. If a child fell ill, it was because she had stolen their vitality to strengthen herself. Each accusation added another stitch to the growing tapestry of fear, a tapestry that would soon strangle her. Yet even in the midst of suspicion, there were those drawn to her, men who courted her in secret, curious despite themselves, boys daring each other to approach her door, hoping to glimpse the forbidden veil. For fear has always carried with it a strange magnetism, and the bride in black was more than a witch, she was a figure of fascination. The whispers that condemned her also elevated her, giving her a terrible kind of power over the village. She was at once victim and predator, scapegoat and sorceress, woven so tightly into their imaginations that they could no longer separate her from the disasters of their lives. Folklore collected centuries later remembers this period as one of escalating dread, a time when villagers claimed even the land bore her. Crooked trees stood near her cottage, twisted unnaturally toward the sky. Mushrooms grew in circles at her doorstep, as though the earth itself acknowledged her otherworldly presence. Travelers who passed through the village said the place felt sick, though they could not say why. To the people who lived there, it was obvious she had poisoned it with her weaving, her veil stretching invisibly across the land itself, and still she went on weaving, always weaving. The sound of her shuttle beating the loom was described in testimony decades later. During the records of her trial, neighbors said it was relentless, that it seemed to echo far beyond her cottage, filling the night with its rhythm. One villager swore that he heard not only the creak of wood, but the muffled cries of men, as though the fabric itself groaned beneath her hands. Whether imagination or truth, the sound burrowed into their minds, until they could think of nothing else. By the time the vanishings, the dead animals, the strange cries and the gossip had all woven together, her fate was already sealed. She had been made into something less than human, something monstrous through the very fabric of their stories. And the veil, still unfinished, grew in the minds of the people, as the repository of every missing life, every unexplained loss, every drop of fear. The whispers of the village were not just background noise, they were the very loom upon which her legend was woven. Each tongue was a shuttle, each suspicion a thread. Together they created a portrait of a woman who could never escape the role forced upon her. Whether she was innocent or guilty no longer mattered. The whispers had already condemned her, binding her more tightly than any rope ever could. By the time the whispers had grown into a chorus, the village could no longer ignore a chilling pattern. It was not only children or travelers who vanished near her home, it was men, suitors drawn into her orbit as if by an invisible thread. They came with offerings, with promises of love or wealth, but they rarely came back, and those who never returned left behind fragments of their lives, fragments that seemed to surface in her weaving. The first story told is that of a merchant, a man of considerable means who traveled between towns with bolts of fabric, spices and trinkets. He was not a fool, nor was he unfamiliar with superstition. Yet even he found himself intrigued by the solitary woman in black. Some said he admired her beauty, others whispered he was enticed by her mystery. Whatever the reason, he was seen calling upon her cottage on more than one occasion. He carried gifts with him, candles, ribbons, lengths of silk dyed deep red, a rare luxury in a rural village. And then, one night, he did not return to the inn where he was staying. His horse was found wandering the edge of the forest, saddlebags intact, as if abandoned. No body was ever discovered. Weeks later, villagers swore they saw something uncanny, woven into the edge of her veil, just visible in moonlight, were threads the same red as the silk he had brought her. The second tale is darker still, for it involves a man of violence, a soldier, home from a recent war, who was known in the village for his arrogance and temper. He laughed openly at the stories of the witch, calling them peasant superstitions. Some say he visited her out of mockery, determined to prove she was nothing but a lonely woman. Others claim he sought to take her by force, believing himself untouchable. He entered her cottage one stormy night, a bottle of ale clutched in his hand. He was never seen again. Days later, a neighbor reported seeing her at her window, veil spread across her lap, and glinting along its edge were small, round objects. When the neighbor looked closer, he swore they were brass buttons, buttons identical to those worn on the soldier's uniform. He told no one at the time, fearing he would be thought mad, but when the soldier's family demanded answers, the story slipped into circulation. The veil, they said, had taken him. The third case chills more deeply, because it was not a man, but a young bride, a woman who had recently married, and who lived near the witch's land. Folklore diverges here. Some say she was a rival who mocked the woman in black. Others say she merely crossed her path at the wrong time. Whatever the truth, the young bride soon fell ill, struck down by a wasting sickness no physician could cure. Her hair began to fall out in clumps until her head was nearly bare. Within weeks she was dead, her new husband left grieving and bewildered. Not long after, villagers swore they saw strands of pale hair woven through the veil, shimmering when caught by lamplight. It was said to glisten like gold against the darker fabric, a cruel trophy taken from a woman whose only crime was being married. These stories spread like fire through the village. Each man who disappeared, each rival who sickened, became another stitch in the legend. People began to see the veil itself not as fabric, but as evidence. They claimed its length had grown unnaturally, as if it expanded with every soul she claimed. Some said when it billowed in the wind, faces appeared in its folds, contorted in silent screams. One man swore he heard his brother's voice when he passed her door, a faint cry carried on the night air. "Help me." Historians and folklorists who later examined the accounts note how carefully these tales were constructed. They resembled the testimonies of a criminal investigation, as though the villagers were building a case against her long before any trial began. But where a court might demand proof, the village needed only rumor. A wandering horse, a missing button, a pale lock of hair, these became their evidence. Each detail, magnified through fear, transformed coincidence into certainty. Not all believed, of course. A handful of skeptics argued that the merchant might have been waylaid by thieves on the road, or that the soldier had fled debts he owed. Illness, after all, was rampant, and the young bride's death could easily have been consumption or fever, but reason could not silence the whispers. The witch in black had become the common denominator for every tragedy, and the veil was the canvas upon which their suspicions were embroidered. Over time, the suitors who vanished became a litany, a grim roll call whispered by firelight. Parents warned their sons not to wander near her home, lest they too be pulled into her weaving. Men who had once courted her from afar now crossed themselves when her name was spoken, and yet, always yet, there were still those who felt the pull. For fear and fascination are two sides of the same coin. There were always new men who lingered too long in her gaze, new voices who insisted they would be the ones to escape her curse, and always the pattern repeated. Folklore insists that by the time she was finally accused outright, the veil had become heavy with stolen essence. It was said to trail behind her not like lace but like a funeral shroud, weighted with something unseen. When she walked through the village, people claimed they heard whispers rising from the fabric, faint as breath yet distinct as words. To some, it was the sound of prayers. To others it was the endless cries of those trapped within. The vanishings cemented her reputation. No longer was she merely an eccentric widow or a scorned bride. She was a predator cloaked in bridal garments, a weaver of death, who ensnared not only men's hearts but their very bodies and souls. In a time when marriage was seen as salvation for a woman, she inverted the ritual entirely, turning the veil of purity into a veil of damnation. Every missing man was not only a loss to his family, but a thread in her bridal garment. And as the stories mounted, the question was no longer whether she was guilty, but how much longer the village would tolerate her presence. The vanishing suitors did more than stain her name, they sealed her fate. For in the eyes of her neighbors, she was not simply a woman living alone. She was a threat to the community's men, to its marriages, to its very future. And in such villages, where survival depended on order, nothing was more dangerous than a woman who could unmake it with a single thread. The stories of the vanished suitors left the villagers uneasy, but it was the veil itself that haunted them most. For what began as rumor soon hardened into something more visceral. It was not enough to say she had killed or cursed. The whispers insisted she had taken what remained of her victims and worked them into her weaving. No longer did they speak of lace or silk. They spoke of flesh. Imagine the loom in her cottage, its wooden frame worn smooth from years of use, the spindle turning in steady rhythm. Neighbors swore that when they passed her house at night, they heard not only the creak of wood, but a sound like sinew being pulled taut, like muscle stretched to its breaking point. Some described a faint metallic tang on the air, as if iron or blood was in the very wind that seeped from her walls. Children dared one another to peek through the shutters, and those who did returned pale and trembling, insisting they had seen not flax but hair stretched across the loom, strands gleaming like pale threads in the candlelight. Hair, after all, was the first material the villagers believed she wove into the veil, locks taken from her victims, either by force or after death. Folklore often imbues hair with spiritual power. It grows even after death. It is intimately tied to one's identity, and to cut it without consent is an act of violation. In many traditions, hair was kept as a token of love or as a charm of control. For the witch in black, the villagers believed it was neither keepsake nor fetish, but raw material. Each strand worked into the fabric was said to tether the victim's soul, binding them to her forever. But the legend does not stop at hair. Darker accounts claim she spun thread from sinew itself, drying strips of flesh until they could be twisted and wound like yarn. The thought is monstrous, yet to the fearful villagers, it explained the veil's uncanny weight, its unnatural sheen. They said when it caught the light, it glistened not like silk, but like something damp, something that had once lived. A handful of testimonies recorded later describe her veil as emitting a faint odor, neither rot nor perfume, but something unsettlingly in between, a sweetness clinging to decay. Bones, too, entered the story. Men who vanished often left behind no remains, but villagers imagined she ground their bones into powder, mixing it with paste to stiffen the cloth. In some versions, she carved thin shavings from femurs, splinters that she wove in as supports, as if the veil's very frame was a lattice of the dead. Tales told around the hearth insist that when the veil shifted in the breeze, it sometimes clicked faintly, as if the fragments of bone inside it rattled together. And always, there was blood. Blood was the substance that terrified them most, for it was life itself. Women who lived near her claimed to see stains upon her doorstep, dark patches she scrubbed, but never quite removed. Hunters returning from the woods said their dogs balked at passing her home, as though the ground itself smelled of slaughter. She was said to soak thread in blood before weaving it, staining the fibers so they pulsed with color. Some believed it was sheep's blood, others that it came from the men who vanished. Either way, the thought of fabric dyed in lifeblood was too horrific to dismiss. To modern ears, such details sound like pure horror folklore, exaggerations born of fear. And yet, there are unsettling parallels. Forensic textile historians have noted that human hair can indeed be woven into fabric. Victorian mourning jewelry often incorporated locks of hair, braided into rings or necklaces. In certain cultures, bone dust has been mixed into pigment for paint or ritual cloth. Even blood has historically been used as a mordant to bind dyes to fabric. These practices were rare and symbolic, never monstrous, but they show that the villagers' fears, though grotesque, were not wholly unimaginable. The leap from symbolic use to cannibalistic weaving was extreme, but in the heightened imagination of a terrified community, it was a leap easily made. Folklore insists that as the veil grew, so too did its horrors. At first it appeared as ordinary lace, albeit darker in hue. But as the vanishings multiplied, its texture seemed to change. Those who claimed to glimpse it said it rippled unnaturally, as if something beneath its surface shifted. Others swore they saw faces pressed against it, mouths opening soundlessly, eyes rolling in despair. The stories could only simmer for so long before they boiled over into open accusation. A single cottage, a single woman, had become the nexus for every fear in the village. Missing men, sickened brides, blood in the soil, faces in the veil. The whispers had swelled until they could no longer be ignored, and in that climate there was only one possible conclusion. A trial in the world of 17th and 18th century Europe. A trial for witchcraft was rarely about justice. It was theater, a stage upon which fear was performed, codified, and sanctified by authority. But even before magistrates and clergy became involved, the village itself acted as judge and jury. The first accusations were not shouted in courtrooms, but whispered at doorsteps, muttered in church pews, pressed into the ears of children. A neighbor would claim she saw a faint red glow in the witch's window. Another swore their milk curdled overnight, After passing her cottage, still another spoke of dreams filled with veils suffocating them. Alone, these suspicions meant little. Together they formed the groundwork of a case. When the local priest finally took notice, the matter shifted from rumor to formal investigation. In those days, priests wielded immense influence, not only over the souls of their flock, but over their fears, and so he called for inquiry. The villagers, trembling yet eager, brought forth their testimonies. The missing merchant's family demanded justice. The soldier's comrades cried for vengeance. The grieving husband of the pale bride begged for answers. One by one, the tales of the vanishing suitors, the whispers of hair and flesh in the veil, were laid out like evidence. Historians studying these accounts note the eerie parallels to other witch trials across Europe and New England. The patterns were nearly identical. Missing livestock, unexplained sickness, and personal grudges were bundled together and presented as proof of witchcraft. In this case, however, the veil gave the accusations a uniquely tangible focus. It was not an abstract claim of curses or storms. It was a physical object, seen, described, and feared. The villagers did not only accuse her of consorting with the devil, they accused her of weaving human remains into her bridal veil, and that image was powerful enough to sway even doubters. The trial itself, if it can be called that, was a mixture of spectacle and cruelty. She was dragged from her cottage one dawn, veil torn from her shoulders, hands bound with rough rope. Villagers gathered in droves, eager to witness the fall of the woman they had long feared. Children stood on tiptoe to glimpse her face. Men jeered and spat. Some women crossed themselves in silence. Others hurled curses as if competing to outdo one another in piety. The accused, by most accounts, walked in silence, her expression unreadable beneath the remnants of her torn veil. That silence unsettled many, for silence can be more damning than denial. Before a magistrate, the charges were read. They accused her of witchcraft, of murder, of consorting with spirits, of weaving human remains into a garment intended for her own unholy wedding. Witnesses gave their accounts: the man who saw buttons glinting in the fabric, the neighbor who heard whispers, the children who swore they saw hands in the veil. Each testimony piled upon the next, building a mountain of suspicion so steep it was impossible to scale down. And yet, when pressed, not one shred of physical evidence was offered. No body, no blood, no scrap of fabric could be presented to prove the charges. Even the veil itself, torn from her shoulders, appeared to be nothing more than dark lace when examined by torchlight. It did not bleed, it did not writhe. It was cloth, ordinary, mundane, stubbornly innocent. But that did not matter. In trials of this nature, proof was secondary. Belief was everything. The methods of interrogation were designed less to uncover truth than to force confession. She was deprived of sleep, questioned relentlessly, threatened with torture. Some accounts suggest she was subjected to the ordeal of water, bound and cast into a river to see if she would sink like the innocent or float like the guilty. Folklore diverges on the result. Some say she floated, condemning herself, others that she sank and was dragged out half dead, only to face further torment. Either way, the ordeal did not exonerate her. Nothing could. What is perhaps most chilling is how the community framed her silence. To modern minds, silence in the face of accusation may signal resistance, disbelief, or resignation. To her contemporaries, silence was proof of guilt. If she did not confess, it was because the devil himself sealed her lips. If she did not beg for mercy, it was because she had none to give. Every gesture, every breath, was twisted into confirmation of her damnation. In many records of witch trials, the accused would eventually confess under duress, fabricating wild stories to satisfy their tormentors. But in this legend, the woman in black never confessed. Was Howard Sintu I Consuk Sintu, Motafia Sintu. Even as she was pressed, even as she was condemned, she denied nothing, admitted nothing, explained nothing. Her silence was absolute, and in that silence, the villagers heard whatever they most feared. When the verdict came, it was inevitable. When the fire finally guttered out, the village square lay heavy with smoke and silence. The woman in black had been reduced to ash, her veil consumed in the flames, or so the villagers hoped. Mothers clutched their children's hands tighter, men exhaled with grim satisfaction, and the priest declared the community purged of evil. Yet even as his words echoed against the scorched timbers, unease seeped through the crowd, for what should have been a moment of closure felt instead like the opening of a wound. The ashes were raked, her charred remains scattered. Some say they were buried at the edge of the village, far from consecrated ground, where weeds and nettles would grow thick. Others whisper the wind itself carried her ashes away, as though unwilling to let her rest in one place. Whatever the truth, the villagers could not help but notice how quickly the sky seemed to darken that evening, clouds thickening as if in mourning or in warning. Superstition thrives on such coincidences, and within hours the storm that broke overhead was spoken of not as weather, but as retribution. The aftermath was marked by contradictions. On one hand, people claimed a lightness in the air, as though an invisible weight had been lifted. Livestock that had been sickly seemed to recover. Children who had suffered nightmares slept soundly. The priest declared it a sign that the village had been cleansed, but others saw the opposite. Milk soured faster, crops failed to thrive, and those who had testified most eagerly against her were struck by sudden misfortunes. A farmer's barn collapsed without warning, crushing 2 oxen. A child developed a wasting fever no doctor could cure. A woman's hair fell out in clumps, eerily reminiscent of the pale bride said to have perished by the witch's hand. These events were scattered, unconnected by reason, yet woven together by fear into a new pattern. The ashes themselves became an obsession. Children dared each other to approach the charred stake, to touch the blackened ground. Some swore that even days later the earth was warm to the touch, pulsing faintly as though alive. A young shepherd claimed he saw footprints in the ash, bare, delicate feet leading away from the pyre and vanishing into the woods. His story spread quickly, igniting whispers that the fire had not destroyed her at all, that she had slipped free at the last moment, leaving only a shadow of herself behind. The priest, alarmed by these rumors, sought to assert control. He ordered the stake torn down, the ashes scattered into running water, prayers recited over the ground. Yet the more he tried to erase the memory, the more vividly it lived on in the villagers' minds. People began to dream of her. Men woke drenched in sweat, swearing they had seen her standing at the foot of their beds, veil flowing behind her, eyes burning like coals. Women whispered of hearing her weeping in the night, the sound so real they rose from their beds to check the doors. Even children spoke of her, describing her figure drifting at the edge of fields, her veil trailing over the wheat. Whether these were visions born of guilt, fear, or something more, they solidified the belief that the witch had not truly gone. She had been burned, yes, but her essence lingered, refusing to yield to mortal justice. In this way, her death did not end the legend, it transformed it. She ceased to be a woman accused and became instead a spectre, an eternal presence bound to the village by fire and memory. Historians analyzing these accounts often note how communities that carried out executions were rarely left in peace. The act of killing, especially under the guise of righteousness, planted a seed of collective guilt, and guilt, when left unacknowledged, curdled into haunting. The villagers had wanted closure, but what they received was a haunting, whether psychological or supernatural. The effect was the same. One chilling detail recurs in later retellings, the belief that the veil had not burned entirely. Though the flames consumed much, some swore they saw scraps flutter away on the wind, glowing ember red before vanishing into the dark. Where did those scraps land? Who might have found them? Folklore insists that at least one fragment survived, retrieved in secret by hands unseen, hidden away as relic or as curse. That fragment, they said, carried with it all the essence of the veil, the whispers, the faces, the hunger. The woman might have perished, but her creation lived on, waiting for the next chapter of its story. In the months that followed, the village remained caught in a strange tension. Outwardly, life resumed, fields were tilled, marriages celebrated, children baptized. Yet beneath the rhythm of daily life, unease remained. People avoided the sight of the pyre. They quickened their steps past her abandoned cottage, now half collapsed, its windows like dark eyes watching. If the execution had been the end of her story, perhaps the legend would have remained nothing more than a cautionary tale told by firelight to frighten children. But the veil itself refused to die. Fire, it seemed, could consume flesh, but it could not erase what she had woven. And so the whispers turned their gaze from the witch herself to the thing she had left behind. Some said the veil was destroyed in the pyre, burned to ash along with its mistress. Yet others insisted fragments survived, shreds that fluttered on the wind, scraps smuggled away by those who dared to keep them. One account tells of a blacksmith's apprentice who, moved by curiosity, or perhaps pity, plucked a glowing ember from the fire and tucked it into his coat. By morning, it had cooled, revealing not charred ash, but a length of lace untouched by flame. The boy, it is said, kept it hidden in a chest beneath his bed. Within weeks, he fell into a strange stupor, muttering in his sleep, his eyes glassy by day. He spoke of voices whispering from the fabric, of faces pressing against it in the night. His body was later found hanging from the rafters, the scrap of veil wrapped around his throat. Another tale speaks of a midwife who retrieved a remnant, believing it to hold protective power. She tucked it away in her apron, thinking it might shield her from sickness or misfortune. For a time it seemed to work. Her patients thrived, her own health flourished. But soon strange accidents began to follow her, infants stillborn, mothers struck with fever, a house fire that destroyed her livelihood. The villagers turned on her, claiming she had inherited the witch's curse, and she vanished into the woods, never to be seen again. Whether she fled in shame or was taken by the veil, no one could say. Through these stories, the veil ceased to be merely a garment. It became an artifact, a cursed object passed from hand to hand, each bearer meeting with tragedy. Folklorists who have studied the legend note how closely these accounts resemble other tales of cursed possessions, the Hope Diamond, the Hands of Glory, or even relics of saints twisted into darker purposes. Such objects act as containers for cultural fear, vessels into which communities pour their anxieties about greed, desire, and transgression. The veil fit this pattern perfectly. Once it had been her personal garment, now it was the embodiment of her legacy. Over the decades, the story of the veil drifted beyond the village. Travelers carried the tale into nearby towns, merchants embroidered it with fresh horrors, and storytellers reshaped it to fit new audiences. In one town, the veil was said to have been discovered in the belongings of a wandering peddler, its threads stained with dried blood. In another, it was rumored to have appeared in a church crypt, hanging from the rafters like a shroud. Legends do not simply fade. They adapt, mutating with each generation that retells them. What began as a village witch's curse became, over centuries, something larger, an inheritance of fear passed down through families, stitched into folklore like another thread of the veil itself. The witch may have burned, but her name, her story, and her veil endured, whispered from one age to the next. In some households, the story was framed as a warning to children. Mothers told their daughters not to linger in front of mirrors at night, lest they glimpse the figure of the woman in black, her veil drifting in the glass like smoke. Fathers warned their sons never to chase strange women on lonely roads, for such temptresses might not be flesh at all, but cloth, an illusion spun by the veil itself, luring men to their doom. What began as superstition hardened into ritual, locks of hair burned after cutting, scraps of lace discarded with care, wedding veils carefully stored to prevent them from attracting unwanted spirits. But the legend of the veil did not remain confined to bedtime tales. By the 18th and 19th centuries, stories emerged of families who claimed to be cursed by it. One rural family insisted that a scrap of lace had appeared mysteriously among their heirlooms, folded into the lining of an old chest. Every bride who wore it as part of her wedding garment met with disaster. One collapsed at the altar, another drowned on her honeymoon, a third vanished entirely on the night of her marriage. The family came to believe the lace was a piece of the witch's veil, and they locked it away in a wooden box sealed with iron nails. But sealing did not silence it. The box was said to rattle on its own at night, and children reported hearing whispers when they passed it. Eventually, the family buried the chest deep in the earth, but the ground above never grew green again. Other accounts tie the veil to specific landscapes. In one region, brides avoided a certain crossroads where the ghost of a veiled woman was said to appear, beckoning men with outstretched hands. Local farmers swore that horses would shy violently at that spot, refusing to cross after dark. In another, an abandoned church was haunted by the rustle of lace, a sound that echoed in the rafters like fabric dragging across stone. Parishioners claimed to feel the brush of cloth against their cheeks during Mass, though no veil was visible. Some even said the crucifix above the altar would sway whenever the phantom fabric passed beneath it. By the late 19th century, when spiritualism swept through Europe and America, the veil resurfaced in seances and mediums' visions. She has many names now. To some, she is the Black Bride. To others, the Veiled Woman. In hushed tones, she is simply her. No matter the title, the stories all share a common image: a woman shrouded in a veil of darkness, drifting where she should not be, her presence thick with dread. Unlike the fragments of lace or whispered folklore, these accounts are visceral, sightings reported, not in books of myth, but in newspapers, diaries, and police records. If the veil became eternal through story, then the woman beneath it found her immortality in shadow. The earliest modern reports of the Bride in Black date back to the late 1800s. In the Bavarian countryside, newlyweds described seeing a veiled woman standing at the edge of their property, silent and motionless, just days after their marriage. When the husband approached, the figure dissolved into the night, leaving only the impression of rustling fabric. A few months later, the bride was found drowned in a shallow stream, her veil tangled like seaweed across her face. The villagers whispered the witch had come to collect another. By the 1920s, stories of the apparition spread across Europe. Rural communities reported encounters on moonless nights, often near crossroads, rivers, or abandoned churches. Always, she appeared as a bride draped in black lace, face obscured, hands pale as bone. Witnesses claimed she never walked but glided, as though her feet hovered inches above the earth. Those who saw her described a suffocating weight, as if the air itself thickened, pressing against their lungs. Some fainted, others fled. Yet a few were drawn toward her, compelled by a strange and irresistible pull. In Italy, a legend emerged of a motorist who picked up a veiled hitchhiker along a lonely road. She sat silently in the back seat until he glanced into the mirror, only to see that her veil was soaked in blood, her face hidden beneath shredded lace. When he turned in terror, the seat was empty. He crashed moments later, his car wrapped around a tree. Locals to this day warn travelers not to stop for women in black on that stretch of road. In France, the bride in black became tied to an abandoned abbey, where visitors reported hearing soft footsteps followed by the unmistakable sound of fabric dragging along stone floors. What makes a curse endure? Why do some stories vanish with the generation that told them, while others persist for centuries, resurfacing in new forms, new places, as though alive? To understand the legend of the witch's veil, one must look not only at history and folklore, but at the hidden architecture of human fear. For the psychology of a curse is not merely about spirits or objects, it is about us. At its core, a curse is a narrative. It binds an object, a person, or a family to a fate that cannot be escaped. The veil, woven from the hair and blood of victims, offered the perfect vessel for such a narrative. Lace itself is delicate, intricate, almost fragile. To twist that beauty into an instrument of death shocks the imagination. The contrast is what makes it unforgettable. A wedding veil, symbol of innocence and unity, recast as a shroud of damnation. Human beings are wired to remember stories that violate expectations. The veil does not frighten because it is monstrous. It frightens because it is familiar, corrupted. Psychologists argue that curses act as cultural mirrors. They externalize anxieties that societies struggle to confront openly. In the case of the witch's veil, The fear centers on marriage, power, and the role of women. For centuries, marriage was not merely a bond of love, but a social contract, a union of families, wealth, and status. A cursed wedding veil attacked the very foundation of that institution. It whispered that love could be poisoned, that unions could bring not joy but ruin. In a world where women were expected to find their worth in marriage, the idea of a bride cursed on her wedding night cut to the bone. There is also the specter of envy woven into the tale. The witch denied love or companionship, created a veil that consumed others' happiness. Modern psychoanalysts interpret her as a projection of suppressed female rage, the shadow of a woman forced into isolation, condemned for refusing submission. The cursed veil, then, is more than a weapon. It is a rebellion stitched in lace. Each victim woven into it represents not only death, but defiance, a refusal to let others live the life she was denied. The fear of the bride in black is, in this sense, the fear of womanhood unbound, uncontrolled, unleashed. Another psychological element lies in contagion. Anthropologists describe the belief that objects can absorb and transmit essence. Hair, skin, fabric, these are seen as vessels that hold the imprint of their owners. The witch's weaving exploited this primal fear. By intertwining hair and blood into the veil, she created not just an accessory, but an object saturated with life and death. When later generations believed fragments of the veil whispered or moved, they were responding to this deep-seated intuition that matter itself can carry memory, trauma, or curse. It is a belief as old as humanity, found in cultures across the globe. But curses are not only about fear, they are about power. A curse gives structure to suffering. Misfortunes that might otherwise seem random, illness, death, failed crops, become explainable when tied to a curse. The veil's legend allowed communities to make sense of tragedies. There is a phrase that lingers through nearly every version of the tale, a whisper repeated across centuries, across borders, across tongues. The veil is not yet complete. Folklorists, priests, and paranormal investigators alike return to this line as though it were the heart of the curse itself. For if the veil remains unfinished, then its hunger remains, and hunger, when left unsatisfied, always returns. The execution of the witch should have ended her story. Fire should have consumed her threads, her victims, her vengeance. But fire cannot unweave. The lace she left behind, whether preserved in fragments or reborn through story, carries with it a sense of incompletion, and so, from generation to generation, the veil does not fade, it grows. Some stories claim that the veil expands through death itself. Every time a bride collapses at the altar, every time a family line withers, every time a veiled figure is seen gliding across a moonlit road, another stitch is added. No one sees the weaving, no one hears the thread pulled through, yet the veil lengthens all the same. In this version, we are all potential victims, our tragedies repurposed as decoration for a garment that may never be worn. Others believe the veil actively seeks its final stitch. That is why the bride in black whispers, "Weave with me." To some, it is an invitation. To others, a command. Witnesses describe feeling a compulsion, a pull in their hands, as though urged to thread needle and lace despite their terror. One woman who claimed to see the apparition on her wedding night reported waking with puncture wounds in her fingertips, as though she had been sewing in her sleep. On her bedside table lay a single strand of black thread, coiled like a serpent. Perhaps the most unsettling testimony comes from a folklorist in the 1930s who traveled through Eastern Europe documenting village legends. In one mountain hamlet, an elderly woman led him into her cottage and showed him a bundle of cloth wrapped in burlap. Within it was a strip of black lace, brittle with age, yet curiously intact. "It waits," the woman told him. "It always waits. One day, someone will finish her work." The folklorist later described hearing rustling from his satchel as he journeyed home, as though the fabric moved of its own accord. He died within a year, his body found slumped over a sewing machine. The lace was never recovered. The fire should have ended her story. The ashes should have scattered her memory to the wind, And yet centuries later, her presence still lingers, not as a body, not even as a veil you can hold, but as a story that refuses to die. In every retelling she is reborn. In every whisper, another thread is added. The witch is long gone, but the veil remains. Across villages, towns, and cities, fragments of the legend still ripple. Some tell it as folklore, a dark fairy tale meant to thrill children around hearthfires. Others share it in hushed tones at weddings, a grim reminder that joy and tragedy are never far apart. In paranormal circles, the veil is discussed not as myth, but as an artifact, an unfinished thing, lurking in private collections or hidden in locked trunks, waiting for the moment it will be worn again. The power of the veil lies in its ambiguity. Is it a physical object, still drifting from hand to hand, pulling ruin behind it? Or is it a spectre, a shadow of memory that clings to brides and travelers alike? Perhaps it is neither. Perhaps it is both. For what is a curse, if not a story given flesh? And what is a haunting if not the memory of a story refusing to let go? Even skeptics who scoff at ghosts admit unease when confronted with the details. Too many brides collapsing at the altar. Too many photographs of veiled women who were never present. Too many dreams of suffocating lace, always accompanied by the same words, "Weave with me." Coincidence, perhaps, but repetition breeds doubt, and doubt is the crack through which fear seeps. In this way, the veil has become something larger than the woman who wove it. She may have been just one accused witch among thousands burned during the witch trials, her name lost to history. Yet her story has outlived them all. She has become an archetype, a symbol of corrupted beauty, of innocence turned predatory, of vows undone,